There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people have accepted without ever really examining it. It is the version where a well-intentioned nation made a tragic miscalculation, where brave soldiers fought under impossible conditions, where politicians failed the men they sent into the jungle, and where the country eventually came to its senses and brought those men home. That version is comfortable because it assigns roles. There are victims and architects. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end shaped by regret. That version exists because it is easier to believe the war was misunderstood than to accept that it was, at multiple levels and across many years, deliberately misrepresented. Not misunderstood by confused men trying their best. Misrepresented by institutions that understood exactly what they were doing and chose to continue doing it anyway. The men who served in Vietnam did not come home silent because the war was too complex to explain. Many of them came home silent because what they had seen did not fit inside any available narrative. Not the heroic one, not the tragic one, not even the anti-war one, which often needed its own kind of simplified story to function. What those men carried was something more corrosive than grief. It was the accumulated weight of a war that had stopped making sense before most of them arrived in it. A war that continued generating missions and body counts and press briefings and medals, while the purpose behind all of it had quietly dissolved somewhere back in the early 1960s, before the first major deployments, before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, before the draft lottery, before any of the names that would eventually be carved into black granite in Washington. This is not a story about heroes or villains. It is not a story about a nation learning from its mistakes. It is an account of 24 specific realities that soldiers lived inside and could not bring home, not because the words did not exist, but because the framework for receiving those words did not exist, and in many cases was actively prevented from existing by the same institutions that had sent those men into the field. The first reality is the one that underpins all the others, and it concerns the nature of truth in a war where measurement replaced meaning. From the earliest stages of American involvement, the military and civilian leadership in Vietnam faced a problem that had no clean solution. The enemy was not a conventional army that held territory in ways that could be mapped and assessed. The Viet Cong and later the North Vietnamese Army operated through networks, through political infrastructure, through the movement of people and supplies, along routes that shifted constantly. The traditional metrics of warfare, territory gained, cities taken, supply lines severed, did not apply in any straightforward way. So the system invented a new metric. It was called the body count. The body count became the central numerical fact of the Vietnam War. Every engagement produced a number. Every number was reported up the chain of command. Every number was compiled into weekly and monthly totals that were briefed to journalists at what became known as the 5 o'clock follies, the daily press briefings in Saigon, where American officials presented statistics that almost no one in the briefing room believed. The body count was supposed to measure progress. It was supposed to demonstrate that American forces were killing the enemy faster than the enemy could replace its losses, that attrition was working, that the war was being won. What it actually measured was something far more troubling. Soldiers in the field understood almost immediately that the body count was not a measure of military effectiveness. It was a measure of institutional pressure. Units that reported high body counts received praise, resources, and positive evaluations. Units that reported low body counts faced scrutiny and skepticism. The incentive was not to accurately report enemy casualties. The incentive was to report numbers that satisfied the commanders above you, who needed to satisfy the commanders above them, who needed to satisfy the politicians in Washington, who needed to satisfy the American public. What this created was a system in which the war was being fought on two separate tracks simultaneously. There was the actual war happening in jungles and rice paddies and village hamlets, where men were dying and killing and surviving as best they could. And there was the statistical war, happening in briefing rooms and report cables and Washington press conferences, where a different war was being described, one that bore an increasingly loose relationship to the actual one. The soldiers who fought the actual war were aware of the statistical war. They knew their body counts were scrutinized. They knew their performance was evaluated partly in terms of numbers they produced, and they adapted. When a unit killed 3 enemy combatants and could not definitively identify whether additional casualties had been inflicted, the pressure was to round up, not down. When civilians were killed in an engagement, the pressure, often unspoken but clearly understood, was to count them as combatants. Any military-age male found dead in a free-fire zone could be classified as a Viet Cong. Any weapon found near a body validated a combatant classification. There were cases where the same bodies were counted multiple times as different units moved through the same area. There were cases where the bodies of South Vietnamese civilians killed by American fire were counted as enemy dead. These were not isolated incidents. They were systemic responses to a system that rewarded numbers over accuracy. The second reality that soldiers could not describe back home was what it meant to operate in a free-fire zone. The terminology itself was carefully managed. In official communications and most press coverage, these areas were called specified strike zones, or sometimes just operational areas. The phrase free fire zone was used in the field, and it described exactly what the designation meant in practice. In a free fire zone, any person who moved was a legitimate target. The designation was supposed to apply only to areas that had been cleared of civilians, areas where everyone remaining had been warned, and where the continued presence of anyone was considered evidence of hostile intent. In practice, the designation was applied far more broadly, and the clearing of civilians was often incomplete, sometimes non-existent, and almost never verified by the units that subsequently operated in those zones. Soldiers who served in free fire zones described a fundamental dislocation between the logic they had been given and the reality they encountered. They were told the zones were empty of civilians. They arrived to find villages that were not empty. They were told that anyone in the zone was enemy. They encountered women and children and elderly men who by any observable measure were not combatants. The rules of engagement told them one thing. Their eyes told them another. And the institutional pressure told them to reconcile these contradictions in favor of the rules of engagement, because the alternative was to report situations that would generate uncomfortable questions. So the contradictions were swallowed. The rules were followed in ways that required a kind of deliberate not seeing, a trained incapacity to process what was actually in front of you. This is one of the things that soldiers could not explain when they came home. Not the violence itself, though the violence was extreme. The deliberate cognitive process of learning to not see what you were looking at. The third reality concerns the Strategic Hamlet program and what happened to the people it was supposed to protect. The Strategic Hamlet program was one of the early large-scale efforts to address the political dimension of the war. The theory was that the Viet Cong drew their strength from the rural population, that they moved among civilians like fish in water, and that by relocating civilians into protected fortified hamlets, American and South Vietnamese forces could drain the sea. The program was implemented across South Vietnam in the early 1960s, and by most available measurements at the time, it was considered a success. Hundreds of hamlets were built. Millions of people were relocated. Reports were filed demonstrating progress. The statistics looked strong. What the statistics did not capture was what relocation meant to the people being relocated. Vietnamese peasant families in many cases had farmed the same land for generations. Their connection to the land was not simply economic. It was spiritual, ancestral, tied to the graves of their ancestors and to obligations that ran deeper than any political program could address. Forced relocation did not win their loyalty to the South Vietnamese government. It destroyed whatever loyalty might have been cultivated. Families that had been neutral or even quietly supportive of the government became supporters of the Viet Cong, not because of ideology, but because of displacement. The Strategic Hamlet program in many areas actively generated the insurgency it was designed to suppress. American and South Vietnamese officials who observed this in the field filed reports describing the counterproductive effects. Those reports were rarely allowed to affect policy. The program continued because the statistics showed success. And success was what the statistics were designed to show. The fourth reality is the corruption of the South Vietnamese government and military, and the degree to which American officials knew about it and continued operating as if it did not exist. The government of South Vietnam under Ngo Dinh Diem and then under the succession of military juntas that followed his assassination was not a functioning democratic ally. It was a fragile, factional, deeply corrupt system that generated its own statistics, its own false reports, and its own strategic fictions with as much discipline as the American bureaucracy. South Vietnamese commanders regularly reported operations that had not taken place. They reported enemy casualties from engagements that had been carefully avoided. They submitted requests for ammunition and supplies that had already been sold on the black market. American advisors who observed these realities and reported them found their reports politely ignored or quietly rewritten at higher levels of the command structure. The reason this corruption was institutionally tolerated rather than addressed was the same reason many things in the Vietnam War were tolerated rather than addressed. Addressing it would have required acknowledging a fundamental problem with the entire strategic premise of the war, which was that South Vietnam could be built into a stable, self-sustaining nation capable of defending itself. That premise was the justification for American involvement. If South Vietnamese institutions were too corrupt, too factionalized, and too disconnected from the population they governed to function, then the entire American mission was built on a foundation that did not exist. Acknowledging the corruption fully and acting on that acknowledgement would have meant acknowledging that the war, as conceived, could not be won. So the corruption was noted, managed, minimized in reports, and ultimately absorbed into the operational framework as a cost of doing business. Soldiers who worked closely with their South Vietnamese counterparts understood the dysfunction in specific, granular ways. They saw which units would fight and which would not. They knew which commanders could be trusted and which ones were negotiating privately with the enemy. They knew that supplies they provided were being redirected. They knew that intelligence they shared was sometimes being passed to the other side. These were not conspiracy theories. These were operational realities that shaped every engagement and every mission. And they were realities that, when reported, tended to disappear into the bureaucratic machinery without generating any visible response. The fifth reality is the systematic destruction of villages and the bureaucratic language developed to describe it. The phrase collateral damage existed in Vietnam, though it had not yet achieved the rhetorical saturation it would later acquire. Villages were destroyed for a variety of reasons in Vietnam. Some were destroyed in the course of combat operations. Some were destroyed as punishment for suspected support of the Viet Cong. Some were destroyed as part of a deliberate policy of area denial, removing the population and the infrastructure that could support enemy operations. The policy had a name in some contexts. It was sometimes described as generating refugees, which is a remarkable bureaucratic formulation because it names the human consequence and presents it as an operational output rather than a moral problem. The soldiers tasked with burning villages, relocating their inhabitants at gunpoint, and destroying the food stores and animals that sustained rural communities were operating under orders that had been reviewed and approved at multiple levels of command. They were not acting outside the system. They were the system's instrument. Many of them came home carrying the specific sensory memories of these operations, the smell of burning thatch, the sounds of families losing everything they owned, the faces of people being forced from the only homes they had ever known, without any available language for describing what they had done that wasn't either self-condemnation or institutional justification. The available civilian vocabulary for war did not include a neutral register for those experiences, so they were not described. The sixth reality concerns what happened to the rivers and waterways and what American forces did in the Mekong Delta, where the war had a different texture than the jungle fighting that dominated most coverage. The Brown Water Navy, the riverine operations, the patrol boat actions in narrow channels where the jungle came down to the water's edge on both sides, These were a separate theater of war with their own logic and their own particular forms of violence. Ambushes on rivers happened suddenly and with enormous lethality. A boat crew had seconds to respond. Return fire went in all directions. Anything on the banks was a target. Villages built on the water's edge, fishermen in their boats, anyone moving near the river during an ambush was in the line of fire from both sides. The accounting of what happened in those moments was even less reliable than the accounting from ground operations because there were no fixed positions, no recoverable terrain, only water and jungle, and the bodies that floated afterward. The Phoenix program, which ran alongside conventional military operations throughout much of the late 1960s and into the 1970s, represented a different kind of operation entirely. The program was designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political cadres, the tax collectors, the village-level organizers who sustained the insurgency. Neutralize was the operational term, and it covered a range of actions from capture to defection to assassination. The program operated through a network of provincial reconnaissance units, which were paramilitary forces trained and often led by CIA officers and special forces personnel. It had a quota system. Provinces were expected to neutralize a certain number of Viet Cong infrastructure members per month. Like all quota systems in Vietnam, it generated pressure to produce numbers regardless of accuracy. The people neutralized under the Phoenix program were not always Viet Cong infrastructure members. Provincial officials used the program to settle local scores, eliminate rivals, remove people who had filed complaints or refused to pay bribes. The program operated outside normal legal processes, outside the visibility of conventional military oversight, and with a tolerance for extrajudicial killing that was understood at the highest levels of both the CIA and the military command. American advisors working within the program knew what was happening. Some were complicit, some were disturbed. Almost none of them had any mechanism for reporting concerns that would result in any change. The program continued because it was producing numbers, and the numbers were being used to demonstrate progress in the war against the Viet Cong political infrastructure. The seventh reality is the experience of soldiers who discovered that the official version of a specific operation or engagement was not what they had witnessed. This happened more often than is generally understood. After particularly costly or controversial operations, there was an institutional process of narrative construction that happened at the command level, and that sometimes bore little relationship to the accounts of the men who had participated. The reasons varied. Sometimes officers were protecting their careers by sanitizing reports of poor decisions. Sometimes the gap between planned operations and actual execution was too wide to be honestly reported without triggering investigations. Sometimes the civilian casualties from an operation were too significant to be accurately described without generating political problems. In all of these cases, the official record was adjusted, and the soldiers who knew the actual record were left carrying a private knowledge that contradicted the public one. For many veterans, this was one of the most specifically corrosive aspects of their experience. Not just the violence, not just the confusion, but the subsequent discovery that the institution they had served had falsified the record of what they had done and seen. The My Lai massacre in March 1968 is the most visible example of this pattern, but it was not an isolated case. It was the case that became impossible to contain. The Army's initial report on My Lai described a successful combat operation against a Viet Cong stronghold with significant enemy casualties. Photographs and survivor testimony eventually made that description untenable. The gap between what had happened and what had been reported was roughly 500 civilians, primarily women, children and elderly men, killed over several hours by soldiers of Charlie Company 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry. The cover-up involved multiple levels of command, lasted over a year, and was undone only because a soldier not present at the massacre, Ron Ridenour, sent letters to members of Congress describing what he had been told by men who were there. The eighth reality is the particular psychology of the tunnel systems and what they demanded of the men who entered them. The Viet Cong had constructed an extensive network of underground tunnels throughout South Vietnam, most famously near Cu Chi, northwest of Saigon, but present throughout the country in various configurations. These tunnels served as command centers, hospitals, supply depots, and living spaces. They allowed the Viet Cong to operate, disappear, and re-emerge in ways that made conventional military responses almost useless. Destroying a tunnel complex required going into it, and going into a tunnel in Vietnam was an experience that occupied a different psychological category than any other form of combat. Tunnel rats, the soldiers who specialized in tunnel clearance, were typically small men, chosen partly for their physical dimensions. They went in alone or in small groups, with a pistol and a flashlight, into spaces so narrow they could barely move their arms, into absolute darkness punctuated by tripwires, punji stakes, snakes, booby-trapped rooms, and the possibility of encountering enemy soldiers who were equally blind and equally committed to killing whoever they found. The psychological compression of that experience, the absence of sky, of horizon, of any of the spatial orientation that military training provides, was total. Men who did it regularly developed psychological responses to that environment that were specific and largely unnameable. There was no available framework for describing what it was to move through the earth itself, looking for people who were trying to kill you in the dark. The ninth reality concerns what happened to the relationship between officers and enlisted men over the course of the war, and specifically the phenomenon known as fragging. Fragging was the killing or attempted killing of officers or NCOs by their own men. The term came from fragmentation grenades, which were a common instrument. The practice was not unknown in previous wars, but in Vietnam it achieved a frequency and visibility that represented something structurally different. It was not simply the violent resolution of personal conflicts, it was the armed expression of a breakdown in institutional authority. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the army in Vietnam was experiencing a crisis of legitimacy at the unit level. Soldiers who had been drafted and sent to fight a war they did not believe in, who were led by officers whose primary motivation in many cases was career advancement rather than the welfare of their men, who were asked to conduct operations that served no discernible tactical purpose beyond generating body counts, were increasingly unwilling to accept the authority of those officers. Fragging incidents were estimated in the hundreds per year at the peak of the phenomenon, though official statistics almost certainly undercounted them because many were reported as accidents or enemy action. The Pentagon eventually acknowledged the problem, but largely treated it as a disciplinary matter rather than as evidence of a fundamental breakdown in the relationship between the institution and the men it was ordering into combat. For soldiers who witnessed fragging or knew it was possible, the experience reorganized the entire social landscape of military service. You were in a unit where the threat of violence was not only external. The men next to you, the officer in front of you, the NCO who gave the order you thought was going to get everyone killed. All of these relationships carried a potential for violence that civilian experience has no framework for understanding. Coming home from that environment and being asked about your military service by someone who had never been in it was an exercise in parallel universes. The 10th reality is the drug landscape of Vietnam and what it meant for the functioning of the military as an institution. By the late 1960s, Vietnam had become one of the most significant drug environments any modern military had ever operated in. Heroin was available in the streets of Saigon at a purity level of over 90% and at prices so low that addiction was accessible to almost anyone. Marijuana was ubiquitous. Opium was available in the highlands. Amphetamines were, in some units and at some periods, officially distributed. The military's response to the drug problem oscillated between denial, punishment, and ineffective treatment programs, none of which addressed the underlying reality that men who had been placed in an environment of sustained, purposeless danger, who were watching their friends die for goals that shifted every 6 months, who were being asked to perform actions they knew were wrong, were going to seek relief from that reality through whatever mechanisms were available. The drug problem in Vietnam was not a failure of individual soldiers. It was a symptom of an institutional failure to provide any coherent purpose for the war at the level where the war was actually being fought. Officers who reported high rates of drug use in their units faced the same institutional pressure as officers who reported low body counts. The incentive was not to accurately describe the problem. The incentive was to manage perceptions. So the drug problem was managed in reports, minimized in official communications, and allowed to metastasize in the actual units operating in the field. The 11th reality concerns the specific experience of black soldiers in Vietnam and the particular burden of racial double consciousness that shaped their service. Black men were drafted and served in Vietnam at rates disproportionate to their share of the general population, particularly in the early years of the war. They were disproportionately assigned to combat roles. They were disproportionately represented in disciplinary actions. They were simultaneously being deployed to defend a country that in many of the states they came from did not allow them to vote, eat at the same lunch counters as white citizens, or live in the same neighborhoods. The civil rights movement was happening at home while they were in the field. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 1968, and black soldiers in Vietnam heard the news in the jungle, often from white soldiers who did not understand why they were affected. The racial dynamics within military units in Vietnam were complicated, and in many cases openly hostile. The late 1960s saw increasing racial tension in American military installations both in Vietnam and in the continental United States. There were riots. There were organized acts of resistance. There were black soldiers who refused orders from white officers on explicitly racial grounds. There were white soldiers who carried Confederate flags. The military command treated racial conflict as a disciplinary problem and addressed it with punishments rather than with any examination of the structural conditions that produced it. Black soldiers who came home carried not only the experience of combat, but the specific experience of having fought for a country that was simultaneously fighting against them, a contradiction that the available veteran narratives had almost no room for. The 12th reality is what happened to soldiers who reported war crimes through official channels. The available mythology of the Vietnam War includes the idea that My Lai was reported and that the system, after some delay, addressed it. What this mythology obscures is the fate of men who tried to report through official channels before Ron Ridenour's letters to Congress forced the issue. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, the helicopter pilot who landed between American troops and Vietnamese civilians at My Lai and threatened to open fire on the American soldiers if they continued killing, filed a report immediately after the incident. His report went into the machinery and produced no visible result for over a year. He was not praised for what he had done. He received threats. His car was vandalized. He was regarded by many in the military community not as someone who had done the right thing, but as someone who had violated unit loyalty. The message that Thompson's experience sent to other soldiers who observed atrocities and considered reporting them was clear without anyone having to state it explicitly. The system did not reward honesty about what was happening in the field. The system rewarded the management of information. Soldiers who reported war crimes faced not only institutional indifference, but active hostility from the communities they belonged to. The social cost of truth-telling was high. The institutional cost of silence was low. Most soldiers chose silence, not because they had no moral awareness of what they had seen, but because the structural incentives made silence the rational choice. The 13th reality concerns the rotation system and what it did to unit cohesion. American forces in Vietnam operated on a 12-month rotation system for individual soldiers, which meant that rather than units serving together for the duration of a campaign and rotating home together, individuals were continuously cycling in and out of units at different stages of their tours. A soldier who arrived in January would be leaving in December, while the men around him were at various stages of their own 12-month rotations. The military designed this system partly to distribute the burden of combat service across the largest possible number of soldiers, but it had catastrophic effects on unit cohesion. In every previous major American war, unit cohesion was the central psychological resource that allowed soldiers to endure combat. The willingness to do terrifying and dangerous things was sustained primarily by commitment to the men immediately around you, men you had trained with, lived with, and depended on across months or years of shared experience. In Vietnam, those bonds were constantly being severed by the rotation system. A soldier who arrived in-country was surrounded by strangers. By the time he had developed relationships deep enough to sustain him in combat, the men he was closest to were rotating home and being replaced by new strangers. The psychological consequence was that soldiers became strategically unattached. They invested less because investing deeply meant repeatedly losing what you had invested in. The short-timer mentality, the obsessive focus on the number of days remaining in your tour, was a natural response to this structural reality. As a soldier approached the end of his rotation, his willingness to take risks declined sharply. He had survived nearly 12 months. He was not going to die in his last week. This created a paradox where the most experienced soldiers in a unit were often the most risk-averse at precisely the moments when their experience would have been most valuable. New soldiers who had not yet fully understood the danger were willing to take risks that experienced soldiers refused. The rotation system thus created a permanent shortage of experienced risk-takers at the unit level and a permanent surplus of inexperienced men learning the hard way what their predecessors had already learned. The 14th reality is the experience of prisoners of war and what it revealed about both the North Vietnamese system and the American institutional response to captivity. American prisoners held in North Vietnamese camps endured systematic torture. This is not a contested fact. The torture was designed to extract confessions, statements of repudiation, and propaganda value, and it succeeded in producing all of these things from men who resisted it with varying degrees of success for varying periods of time. The standard military position embodied in the Code of Conduct was that prisoners were to give only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. It was known by every prisoner and by the military command that most men eventually gave more than this under torture, and the military's official position made no functional provision for this reality. The men who returned from North Vietnamese captivity and who had made statements, signed documents, appeared in propaganda films, were then required to demonstrate that their actions had been involuntary and had resulted from torture that met a specific threshold. The process of making that demonstration required them to describe their experiences in detail to military investigators in an institutional context that was inherently adversarial. The military needed them to be either heroes who had resisted successfully or victims who had been broken against their will. What most of them were was something more complicated. Men who had endured as long as they could, who had eventually given something, who had then had to continue living with themselves in conditions of ongoing captivity, and who had developed psychological strategies for survival that did not map neatly onto either heroism or victimhood. The 15th reality concerns the specific experience of soldiers who served in the later years of the war, after the Tet Offensive of 1968 had fundamentally changed the domestic political landscape of the conflict. The Tet Offensive was a massive coordinated attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces across more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam, including a brief assault on the American embassy compound in Saigon. The offensive was militarily defeated. American and South Vietnamese forces drove back the attackers at significant cost to both sides. But the television images of Viet Cong fighters inside the American embassy compound had a psychological impact on the American public that no military victory could offset. The administration had been saying the war was being won. The images from Tet said something different. After Tet, the institutional narrative of the war began to separate from the actual conduct of the war in a new and more explicit way. The war continued. American soldiers continued to be sent to Vietnam, continued to fight and die, continued to conduct operations, continued to produce body counts. But the political consensus that had sustained American involvement was fracturing. The men serving in Vietnam after Tet were fighting a war that a growing portion of the public had concluded should not be fought. while the institutional machinery of the war continued to operate as if the political foundation beneath it was solid. The gap between what soldiers were being asked to do and the political support for asking them to do it grew steadily through 1969, 1970, 1971, and into the final years of direct American involvement. The 16th reality is what the anti-war movement meant to soldiers in the field, and why the relationship between veterans and anti-war activists was more complicated than the simplified narrative of the spat-upon veteran allows. Some soldiers in Vietnam agreed with the anti-war movement, some were indifferent to it, some were actively hostile. But the most common reaction among soldiers in the field was not to the political position of the anti-war movement, but to the specific social reality it represented, which was that the country at home was having a different experience of the war than the country in Vietnam. Soldiers could hear through their mail, through their occasional access to news, through the conversations they had in the rare moments away from the field, that back home the war was an abstraction to be argued about. In Vietnam, it was a physical fact with immediate lethal consequences. The anti-war movement's portrayal of soldiers as either victims of an unjust system or perpetrators of American imperialism left very little room for the actual complexity of what soldiers were experiencing. The movement needed soldiers to be one or the other for its own rhetorical purposes. Some veterans were willing to fill one of those roles. Most were not. The soldiers who came home and found no available narrative for their experience, not the government's narrative of heroic service and strategic necessity, not the anti-war movement's narrative of victimhood or complicity, were the ones who most often went quiet and stayed quiet for decades. They did not become prominent speakers for any position because no available position accurately described what they had seen and done. The 17th reality is the specific geography of the war in the Highlands and what the Montagnard people experienced at the hands of all parties to the conflict. The Central Highlands of Vietnam were home to a number of indigenous tribal peoples collectively referred to as Montagnards by the French and by American forces. These communities had distinct languages, cultures, and historical grievances against lowland Vietnamese of both the North and the South. American Special Forces, particularly the Green Berets, had extensive contact with Montagnard communities and developed relationships of genuine mutual respect in many cases. The Montagnards made effective fighting forces. Many of them fought alongside American Special Forces for years. What they received for this service from the American side was, at the end of the war, abandonment. The Montagnards who had fought alongside American forces were left behind when American forces withdrew. They faced reprisals from both the North Vietnamese and the post-war South Vietnamese government. The Special Forces soldiers who had served with them and who cared about what happened to them had no mechanism for protecting them. The institutional machinery simply moved on. The individual soldiers who had formed bonds with Montagnard fighters, who had made implicit promises of protection through the simple act of fighting alongside someone for years, came home carrying the knowledge that the people they had fought with had been left to consequences that were entirely predictable and were not addressed. The 18th reality concerns the air war, and specifically what the bombing campaigns did and did not accomplish, and how the results were measured. The United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos than were dropped by all sides in the entire Second World War. This is a statistical fact that tends to stop conversation rather than advance it, because it is difficult to process what that quantity of ordnance means in terms of the landscape, the people, and the actual military effects. The air war was supposed to interdict North Vietnamese supply lines, destroy military infrastructure, and degrade the ability of the North Vietnamese government to continue supporting the insurgency in the south. The bombing campaigns were extensive, sustained, and in many specific instances technically successful in destroying specific targets. What they consistently failed to do was achieve the strategic objective of forcing North Vietnam to the negotiating table on American terms, or degrading its capacity to continue the war to a degree that changed the outcome. The North Vietnamese adapted. They moved supplies by night. They used human porters on trails that aircraft could not effectively target. They repaired roads and bridges faster than they could be destroyed. They accepted civilian casualties as a cost of continuing the war that was politically sustainable, in a way that the American public's tolerance for casualties was not. The bombing continued because stopping it required acknowledging that it was not working at the strategic level, and acknowledging that would have raised questions about what was working, to which the honest answer was very little. The specific reality that ground soldiers lived inside during this period was the awareness that the enormous resources of American air power were being continuously applied and were not producing victory, and that no one with the authority to change the strategy seemed willing to say this out loud. The Air Force was reporting sorties and damage assessments and bomb tonnage in the same way the Army was reporting body counts, as a demonstration of activity and effort that was being presented as evidence of progress. The soldiers who looked around them at the same landscape after months of continuous bombing and saw the same enemy conducting the same operations lived in the gap between those reports and what they could see with their own eyes. The 19th reality is the specific experience of medical personnel and what they witnessed that distinguished their experience from most accounts of the war. Medics and corpsmen in Vietnam occupied a unique position. They were present at the moment of catastrophic injury. They were responsible for keeping men alive in conditions that were often impossible. They had skills that were constantly in demand, and that created a specific kind of attachment to the men they treated, an attachment made more intense by the knowledge that the next patrol would produce new casualties and that the work never ended. Field hospitals in Vietnam were processing casualties at rates that taxed every available resource. The nature of the wounds produced by the weapons of the Vietnam era, M16 rounds, claymore mines, booby traps, using large explosive charges, artillery, was severe. Traumatic amputations were common. Head wounds that would have been uniformly fatal in previous wars were sometimes survivable with immediate aggressive surgical intervention, which produced survivors with injuries of a severity that American medicine had rarely dealt with. Medics who came home were carrying not just the memories of the men they had saved, but the specific sensory catalog of the men they had not saved, the ones who bled out before the medevac arrived, the ones who were wounded so severely that saving them was not possible, the ones who died asking to be told they were going to be all right. The specific cruelty of that position, being the person to whom someone dying turned for reassurance, being the person who knew the reassurance was false and who had to decide in real time what to say, was something that medical personnel carried with exceptional specificity. They did not lose the sensory details the way some combat veterans lost them. They retained them with clinical precision because their training had required them to observe and catalogue. Coming home with that catalogue and being in a world that had no place for it was its own particular form of dislocation. The 20th reality concerns what happened in Cambodia and Laos, the wars that ran alongside the acknowledged war, and that for years the American government officially denied were happening. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply network that moved men and materiel from North Vietnam to South Vietnam through the territory of Laos and Cambodia, was the logistical spine of the North Vietnamese war effort. Interdicting it was a strategic imperative for American commanders. But Laos and Cambodia were officially neutral countries. Conducting military operations in their territory without their consent was a violation of international law. The American government's response to this problem was to conduct the operations anyway, and to classify them. The bombing of Cambodia began in 1969 and continued for 4 years. It was known within the military and government. It was concealed from Congress and the public through a system of falsified operational reports in which bombing missions flown in Cambodia were recorded as having occurred in South Vietnam. Soldiers on the ground in Cambodia, special forces units running classified reconnaissance missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, were operating under standing orders to deny their presence if captured or if questioned by journalists. They were in a war that officially did not exist. The psychological effect of operating in a context where the basic facts of your location and your mission were classified was one of the more specific forms of institutional unreality that Vietnam produced. When the Cambodian incursion became public in 1970, the political explosion it triggered resulted in 4 dead students at Kent State and a national crisis of institutional credibility. But the soldiers who had been operating in Cambodia before the public disclosure had already been living inside that crisis for months. They had been asked to conduct operations in a country the government was publicly denying they were in, under orders designed primarily to maintain a political fiction rather than to achieve any military objective that could be honestly evaluated. The 21st reality is what happened to the war after Vietnamization. The Nixon administration's policy of transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. Vietnamization was presented as a strategy for success, as the development of South Vietnamese capacity to the point where American military presence would no longer be necessary. What it was in practice was a managed withdrawal that needed to produce enough political cover to allow the administration to disengage from a war it had concluded was not winnable, without triggering a political crisis of the magnitude that would have resulted from an honest acknowledgement of that conclusion. South Vietnamese forces were given equipment, training, and air support. They were asked to take on missions that American units had previously conducted. Their performance was variable in ways that confirmed what American advisors had been reporting for years and that continued to be managed in official assessments. The 1972 Easter Offensive, in which North Vietnamese forces conducted a massive conventional invasion of South Vietnam, came close to collapsing the South Vietnamese military entirely and was stopped primarily by American air power rather than by the South Vietnamese ground forces that Vietnamization had supposedly prepared. The lesson was clear to everyone who observed it closely. The lesson was not publicly stated. American soldiers who served in the Vietnamization period were engaged in a transition that their commanders knew was not producing the outcome it was officially designed to produce. They were training South Vietnamese soldiers, and watching units equipped with American weapons and American training failed to perform at the level that American policy required them to perform at for the policy to be coherent. They were watching a fiction being constructed and were being asked to participate in constructing it. The 22nd reality is the specific experience of soldiers who served multiple tours and what it meant to return to a war that had changed while also staying the same. Some soldiers returned to Vietnam for second and third tours voluntarily. Some returned because the military needed their specialized skills. Some returned because they had found that civilian life in America was harder to navigate than combat, for reasons that the Veterans Administration in the early 1970s had essentially no framework for addressing. Men who returned to Vietnam for a second tour after a period in the United States found a war that had shifted in ways both visible and invisible. The political environment in country had changed. The relationship between American units and South Vietnamese forces had changed. The morale of American forces was visibly degraded compared to earlier years. Drug use was more visible. Racial tension was more overt. The relationship between enlisted men and officers had deteriorated. The war looked the same from the air, the same landscape, the same fire support bases and patrol routes and village operations. But the human texture of it was different. The institutional confidence that had characterized American forces in the earlier years of major commitment had eroded, replaced by a kind of institutional going through the motions that soldiers could feel in the daily rhythm of operations. The 23rd reality is what happened after the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 and the period between the official end of American combat involvement and the fall of Saigon in April 1975. The Paris Accords ended direct American military participation in the war, while leaving North Vietnamese forces in place in South Vietnam, and providing a framework for political reconciliation that both sides knew would not be honored. American prisoners of war came home. American troops came home. The South Vietnamese government was left with a promise of continued American support that was progressively undermined by congressional restrictions on funding and by a domestic political environment in which sustained support for South Vietnam had ceased to be viable. The South Vietnamese military fought for 2 years after the American withdrawal with diminishing resources and diminishing morale. In the spring of 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a conventional military offensive that encountered less resistance than anticipated and quickly became a rout. The fall of the provincial capital of Ban Mi Thuot in March 1975 triggered a collapse that proceeded faster than anyone had predicted. Within weeks, major cities were falling. Within days of the fall of Da Nang, Saigon itself was under threat. The evacuation of American embassy personnel and some South Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans proceeded in chaotic circumstances that were broadcast live on American television. The images of the evacuation, the helicopters on the embassy roof, the crowds of Vietnamese trying to reach American aircraft, the burning of documents, the cutting of losses, were watched by veterans in the United States who had served in Vietnam and who processed those images through the specific knowledge of what the war had cost and what it had produced. The war they had fought, the war that had cost roughly 58,000 American lives and several million Vietnamese lives, had produced this outcome. The country they had fought to defend had lasted 2 years after their departure before collapsing under the force of an offensive that their presence had delayed but not prevented. The 24th reality is the most diffuse and in some ways the most important. It is not a specific incident or policy or program. It is the reality of what happens to an institution when it spends years generating false information about itself and then has to continue functioning after the false information has been exposed. The American military that emerged from Vietnam was an institution that had told itself and told the public a consistent set of lies about what it was doing and achieving for the better part of a decade. It had suppressed or punished accurate reporting at multiple levels of its hierarchy. It had created incentive structures that rewarded the production of satisfactory statistics over the production of accurate ones. It had built a culture of managed truth that permeated the relationship between field-level soldiers, mid-level officers, senior commanders, civilian leadership, and the public. What this did to the institution over time was to erode the trust that all military organizations depend on to function. The trust between soldiers and the officers who lead them. The trust between the military and the civilian government that authorizes its operations, and the trust between the military as an institution and the public that funds it and provides its personnel. The Vietnam War did not simply cost the military a specific number of casualties in a specific theater. It cost the institution something harder to quantify and longer to recover. It cost the coherence of its own internal truth-telling. The soldiers who came home silent understood this, at varying levels of articulation, without necessarily having the language to describe it in institutional terms. What they knew in specific and personal terms was that the institution they had served had not been honest with them about what they were fighting for, had not been honest about whether what they were doing was working, had not been honest about what the consequences of their actions were, and had not been honest in its accounting of what had happened when the war was over. The silence many of them maintained was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had said things and had not been heard, or who had concluded that saying things produced no change in the machinery that had already moved on to the next operation, the next mission, the next set of statistics that would demonstrate whatever the institution currently needed demonstrating. The war in Vietnam officially ended for the United States with the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975. On that day, the last American personnel were evacuated from the embassy rooftop. The North Vietnamese flag was raised over the presidential palace. The government of South Vietnam, whose preservation had been the stated reason for American involvement since the mid-1950s, ceased to exist. In the years that followed, the Vietnamese government would report that the war had cost approximately 3 million Vietnamese lives. The United States would eventually build a memorial wall in Washington bearing the names of 58,318 Americans killed in the conflict. The wall is black and reflective. If you stand in front of it, you can see yourself in the names. The last American combat soldiers left Vietnam in 1973. Unexploded ordnance from the bombing campaigns continued killing Vietnamese civilians for decades afterward. In 2023, the Vietnamese government estimated that more than 40,000 people had been killed by unexploded bombs and mines since the war ended. The land was still at war with the people who lived on it.